distance.
Good morning, everybody. You can probably hear it in my voice that I'm sick. So if I sniffle or cough or have to like blow my nose during this stream, I'm really sorry. But I didn't want to skip out on streaming just because I'm feeling a little bit under the weather. So today we're going to be talking about punchy sound effects editing, like making sound effects that cut through a mix and stand out and really add a lot to whatever you're working on. It could be a film, could be a YouTube video, TV show, podcast. Even podcasts have great sound effects a lot of the time. So a big question I get is, how do I make my sound effects punchy, or, basically just pop, make the sound effects really stand out. So that's what we'll be talking about today. And this is going to be guided by your guys' questions and your comments and any kind of feedback. So whether you're watching this live or on replay, please, drop a chat or comment, ask questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. So we're going to be working in Pro Tools today, but these techniques are platform agnostic. Really doesn't matter what DAW or program you're in. This is going to be good for anything. Pro Tools, Ableton, Final Cut, DaVinci, Premiere, whatever. And we've already got some questions, so I just want to go through these real quick. Jay from New Mexico says, my challenge I've noticed is getting hit slams and explosion dynamics to translate for everyone listening on headphones, bars. Oh, sound bars. Okay, in cinema. It's great to give a good scare or explosion with clarity. And so a big issue with translating stuff is mix dynamics, and especially for like maybe the more limited dynamic range type of mixes like TV or web, it can be hard when everything's loud, nothing is, so if the dialogue is super loud and the music is super loud, the sound effects are not going to feel as loud, just because you don't have enough headroom in your track to make the sound effects really stand out. So you're kind of limited by whatever platform you're mixing for. Obviously, a cinematic, feature film that's going to theaters is going to have the widest dynamic range, and the web mix that's going to YouTube is going to have the least dynamic range. But there's some things you can do in your mix to make sure that the sound effects have room to, breathe and cut through stuff. So we'll get into that, and I have an outline here. So let's just talk about what makes sound effects punchy. And what makes sound effects punchy is a combination of three things to me. It's the right sounds at the right moment, at the right balance or level. And you could talk about frequency balance or volume level, but it's those three things. It's the right sounds at the right moment, at the right level. If you have those three things, the sound effects are going to cut through. They're going to sound great. If any one of those three things is not correct, the sound effects are not going to sound good. They're not going to be punchy. They're not going to cut through. And the biggest problem I see people struggle with is selecting the right sounds. And it is something that kind of comes with experience of just doing it for long enough to be able to hear the difference between the right sound and maybe not the right sound, or to have a sound that is almost right and be able to push it over the top to where now it's the correct sound. There's not really shortcuts for that. It's really just something that comes with experience. But I'll kind of show you some stuff that I listen for when I'm looking at sound effects. So then we also have transient clarity. If you're talking about punches and gunshots and explosions and impacts, having a clear, defined transient and the right contrast in the dynamics between the transient and the body of the sound, that's really important. Frequency separation, that's important. And then also the other elements in the mix. If you're just editing sound effects, you can listen in a vacuum. But if you're mixing, or if the project just has other elements, dialogue and music, you need to make sure the sound effects play nicely with those other elements. And if you're not mixing, that means when you're selecting the sounds, they need to complement the score. They need to work with the dialogue. If you're just listening in a vacuum and you solo the sound effects, yeah, they're going to sound great. Once you add the other elements, it's not really going to work. So make sure you have the context of those elements and you're listening to them. Okay, and then the biggest variable is your sound library. If you don't have a big sound library, that needs to be your focus. You need to work on getting more sounds. You need to work on, getting to know your own library. And if you don't have a certain type of sound and you're like, I don't know, maybe you need to buy something to supplement your library or go out and record it with your own mics. That's always a great option. And then the cool thing then is your library it's yours. Nobody has those sounds. You have them all to yourself. So those are a couple things to work on, like as far as having access to the right sounds. Work on your library. It's never finished. My sound library, it's like 2 terabytes. It's in flux. It's always it's in process. So never give up on that. It's kind of like working on a skill. Like you're never done learning. You're never done getting better at something. It's a continual process. So just keep working on your library. Couple of examples of great sound effect sequences, and we're going to talk about why they're great. The Bourne series, Bourne, Jason Bourne, I think. All those fight sequences, it's something directors constantly reference when I'm working with them. I want the fights to sound like Jason Bourne. And one of the reasons those fights sound so brutal is because there's no music. It's just hand-to-hand combat. So that's a series to check out. Another one, I know a lot of millennials watch my stuff, so I have to mention Harry Potter at some point. The Order of the Phoenix, when Dumbledore and Voldemort are fighting, that has no music. It's great, like fantasy sound design for that, and the sound really helps sell the fight and kind of tell the story of it. Saving Private Ryan, the opening of that with the Rickos and the bullet buys and the underwater, above water, just the like fog of war and chaos. That's a great example. Castaway, when Tom Hanks's character gets to the island, like in the waves, gosh, there's so many layers to those waves and they sound perfect. And I can't imagine how much time was spent. I'm sure there's some kind of like, special video on that. I think actually in the special features on a Blu-ray, they talk about that. And then the whole movie of No Country for Old Men. It's one of my favorite movies. There's hardly any music and the sound really grounds that. So those are some things to check out for examples. So let us look at a sound library. Here's my sound library. I was looking at some punches this morning just to, kind of prepare for the stream. And the first thing you'll see in a library is you have building blocks, but then you also have sounds that are already kind of built. So if I just look for punch, there's all kinds. It's like Indiana Jones style punches, but kind of the better ones are these construction kits. And I'm trying to remember. This is from the Boom. Yeah, Boom. So the Boom library content, Boom is great. They usually have on all their libraries, they'll have the construction kits, which is the individual layers, and then they'll have the designed. So if you're just looking for like a single audio file to throw in, they'll have designed punches. If you pay the extra, you get both design and the construction kit. The construction kits are usually more expensive standalone, but then you can start layering stuff to make custom punches. So that's, if you look here, I've got like low, there's smacks, there's slaps. So when you're building punches, you'll often layer, 4 or so of these to get the right type of punch sound. And we will do that momentarily. I just want to look through a library real quick because the biggest variable is your sound library. How strong is your sound library? And I see people get into this rabbit hole of like, well, I just need to mix. I just need to mix these sounds to make them sound right. And that is the wrong mindset to have. I always tell people, go back to your edit. Go back to your sound edit. there's a good chance you don't have the right sounds. If you're having to EQ the crap out of stuff and process it and run it through a bunch of compressors and stuff, it's probably the wrong sound. Go back to your sound edit and fix the problem, which is the source material. So let's go ahead and make a punch sound. I've got, this is Family Heirloom, which is like a practice project. And I have to blow my nose, so I'm going to mute myself. All right. Thank you for being patient while I'm sick. I'm playing through the pain. So we've got a, yeah, you guys can see this. The video is going to be kind of small, so we can look at the timeline and the chat too. We've got an impact here. Use markers. You can also use region groups. We're not really going to talk about spotting, but it can be useful to use region groups, which is Option Command G. I don't know if you can do this in other DAWs. So this is an elbow to a face, and let's start building this punch. Mr. Nelson says, so it's best to solve as many problems through editing than mixing. Yes. A good edit will make your mix go so much faster. I need to put on headphones here. All right. So you guys want to start from the top or the bottom when it comes to frequencies? Let me know. I'm going to start grabbing some stuff. Sure. No. Yeah, let's do that. We're going to get a low in here. Go with that one. I'm just grabbing stuff. I'm waiting for somebody to tell me if you want to start with low or high frequencies. Top. Okay, good. Oops. Yeah, that didn't. Okay. Command Z. Oops. Dang it. I'm like not quite there this morning. Sorry. We'll start from the top. So we got a slap. We're also going to want a little bone break. Yeah, shorter is better. We're going to talk about micro placement of all this stuff. I'm just trying to get stuff on the timeline. And you notice I'm typing CK because I know in my library, I've got this Boom Library construction kit, which is CK, and CC is close combat. So close combat construction kit. Yeah, let's do that one. Okay, so in my timeline here, I've got high, I've got a slap, I've got a mid, and I've got a low. I've got a cloth, and I've got a bone break. Now, how am I going to arrange all this? This is going to vary, you know, based on what you like, if you're mixing or if somebody else is mixing. I like to stair-step my sounds so that they go from like left to right and top to bottom. So you want to have some kind of whoosh before your punch. That really helps sell it. And then on the marker, on the impact here, maybe like just before the frame is where I'm going to align everything. And then the bone break actually needs to happen slightly after the punch. So let's listen to each layer by itself. So there's a cloth. It says grab, but it's really more of a whoosh. Then we've got a slap. Then we've got a mid. Then we've got a low. And then a bone break. So this low, I wore a beanie because I didn't brush my hair or anything because I'm sick and I'm just like disgusting. And there we go. Now I can hear the lows. Let's do a different low. I don't really like that one. That's better. Do that first one. Okay, so let's listen to them all together now. It's fine. Maybe like the slap is a little too much in the mid, and the bone break can probably come down and maybe shorten that. Go. Maybe move this just half a frame later. So it sounds fine, but it's not quite punchy. And a good pro, it's not really a secret, it's just a good tip for this, is to use something like auto align post to line everything up, because you have all these different layers, and when you're layering stuff, even if you have them perfectly aligned, the phase relationship on these different sounds is not the same. So to make it truly punchy, align these to the low frequency layer. So this is on M SFX4. We'll set this to M SFX4, and we're not going to line the cloth, and we're not going to line the bone, because they don't happen on the same frame. But everything that happens on the same frame, we're going to render it. And so it's flip the phase and it's align these sounds. And here's the difference. And I'll undo so we can hear the difference. So it sounds punchier. It's probably harder to pick it up on the stream because it's a compressed audio feed, but in my headphones I can hear the difference, that with them aligned, everything sounds cohesive, and the lows especially are a lot punchier. Cool. So I'm happy with that. Maybe I'll balance it a little different though. Like maybe I'll take out the mid and the slap and see. So yeah, it just doesn't have the same thing. Now, another thing we can do, this is just raw audio at this point that's been cut in and aligned. And that's fine. Like you can do that. You can get an entire sound effects edit with no processing and it will sound good. But if you wanted to start to process this, let's go to dynamics. And clever limiting is a huge boost to the punchiness of your sounds. And I actually have a preset for this in FabFilter Pro L2. You could use any limiter for this. A limiter is going to chop the top on a sound. So I'm going to process this, and then I'm going to drag this to my second monitor in case I need to reuse it. Let's hear the difference now. Okay, undo. So the low end comes through a lot better. Let me make sure. Okay, that's good. Another thing we can do, I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to bring up my Pro Subharmonic. I think I had a preset for this as well. No, I didn't. That's okay though. Oh, and my preview isn't set to play for you guys, so I'll just go with something that I think will work. And let's hear it. A little more. There we go. Okay, so now we're getting some of that kick drum thump, and I'm going to go back to Pro L2, load my action preset. This will also keep you from clipping your channel. If you use a limiter, you'll get more volume without clipping. There we go. Okay, so now play it all together. Okay, now we're talking. This sounds brutal. It sounds punchy, and it's going to cut through pretty much anything. We have a couple questions here. What's a good transient plugin from Matthew Barr in Hong Kong? Bittersweet is free. I like that one. Yeah. Jay says EQ and summing balance so I don't blow out my ears or speakers is key. Routing the group bus through a limiter. Always use a limiter on your groups or your submasters. Simon says, that's what I would have in projects. I always receive not enough layers. If the budget's there, I'll add, but often I need to go through with what I receive. Yeah. So if you get sound effects that you don't have time to re-edit, using a combination of Pro Sub and this is Pro Tool specific, but some kind of subharmonic generator and limiting are like, with weak stuff that doesn't have enough low end and needs to have that thump, Pro subharmonic plus a limiter is pretty much all you need. Paco says, I've always used tab to transient to align. Yeah, that works. The problem you have with that is sometimes they have pre-sounds, like especially this slap has a little bit of sound before it. So if you tab to transient, you'll be cutting off some useful stuff. You know, you'll be cutting off this part. And like this low punch has a little bit of that too. So if you tab to transient, you end up losing some of that content. Whoops. Let's see if this will actually tab. Yeah, so in tab to transient doesn't work all the time. It's like, I don't know where the transient is. So I like to do it visually. Canuck Abroad says, when I struggle for punch, I always try and add quarter to 1 frame of silence prior to the transient. Yes, that's a great trick. V-cut and volume automation is another great trick. What's the reason for aligning to the low frequency as opposed to the high frequencies? Good question. By aligning to the low frequencies, it allows that thump to be kind of the driver of where things are aligned. And usually that's where people feel the impact, is they feel it in the lows. And also that tends to be where the worst phase problems are. So good question. So here's a punch and we've got it. You know, we can rebalance this if we want like less high frequencies. We can always bring these down. Like that's pretty good. You know, you get a little bit of the slap. And I'll show you if we mute the mid and high is what it sounds like. It just sounds mushy. This is a good example of a big problem with beginner sound edits is this is what the punches sound like. They're just all lows. And Jay, that is exactly what you're talking about, the translation to other mediums like phones or TVs. You have to have the mids and the highs for that stuff to translate. If I mute the lows, you don't get the same impact, but it's still there. So we'll call that good on this punch. And we talked about layering, knowing your library. Recording your own material can be a really good way to get around a lackluster sound library or one that maybe doesn't have enough content, because it's expensive to buy sound effects. They're usually $300 minimum. Some of them are thousands. So you can easily get into like $5,000-$10,000 worth of sound effects, and then you still have sounds you don't need. So get a recorder. I've got my F6 here with a giant battery on the back, and I take this out pretty regularly with a shotgun mic and a stereo pair or a stereo mic. Record what I need, and that's a great way to supplement your library or even build a library completely from scratch. Just, it's going to take a while, so keep that in mind. All right. Man, kids going back to school, it always happens like within the first couple weeks. They get sick, they bring it home, I get sick. So keeping my immune system in check here. All right, we talked about a little bit of clip gaining, balancing. We're really focused on this punch here, but you can see the way I've balanced things. The high frequency is dipped quite a bit. It's kind of stair-stepped, like the lows have a lot of energy and the highs have not quite so much, mostly because he's cut through really well. The whoosh part, the clothy stuff, you can lower this. I'll show you the difference in this punch if I mute it though. It's fine, but it doesn't have the rhythm of that. And you can even slide this back. Usually it's set to subframes. You can slide this back like a frame. The more space you have between the whoosh and the punch, the slower the punch will feel. So that's 1 frame back. Here's 1 frame right. And that's, you know, again, 1 frame earlier and 1 frame later on the whoosh. So it happening like a frame before the punch sells it as like cohesive, and with a frame earlier, it's more like slow, you know, disconnected. So spacing stuff out, super important. And you can see the bone crunch doesn't happen on the punch. It happens afterwards, a frame after. Let's break also sounds into the actual sound, the preceding sound, and the result or effect of the sound. This, you can do the same thing with gunshots. We're gonna have no video for this part. Let's make a gunshot sound real quick. And I'll show you how I like to do these. So first you need a dry fire. Ugh, that's super old. Sure, let's go with that one. That's like a pistol or a revolver. So we got a dry fire. Let's just say this is a python, Colt python.
This is the Colt python.
Let's do, yeah, interior. Interiors are usually harder. For gunshots, I like to have some stereo layers, just because for a 5-1 mix, it's nice to spread the gunshot out over more than just the center channel. Let's just do a revolver. So this is a design sound, and you can hear it's got the dry fire at the head of the file, which is cool. There we go. That's nice. Do we want this to be like an Indiana Jones type of gun, or do we want it to be realistic? That's nice. That's like at a shooting range. We'll make this the Indiana Jones type of gun. We'll add a howitzer to it. Nice. Super loud. And then another thing I like to do is add some thunder rumbles. We'll do that. We'll do a realistic version of this, and we'll do a Hollywood Indiana Jones style. So for the realistic, we'll mute the howitzer. So for a gunshot, let's just hear what this sounds like. It's a little too bright. We need some body to it. It's one thing about guns is like realistic guns do sound kind of bright and like just like fireworks basically. Let's add a 45. We're gonna make this. So guns, it's nice to have them be the real sound, and some directors want the real, like I just want it to sound real. But you don't always have to do that. Baby Desert Eagle, that's funny. Usually you have to kind of... Sure, let's do that, the classic. Usually you have to sweeten them a little bit. But there's always, you know, the directors who like, no, I want the real guns. And then like, okay, that's what you got to do. So there we go. So tab to transient does work. It's nice to line things up to the frame edge if you can. So I'm tabbing to transient, I'm hitting A, and then I'm grabbing and I'm moving there. So let's just go through these layers real quick. I've got a dry fire, which needs to be like a half a frame before the actual gunshot. Then I've got the little pop. That's more of a distant sound. That's like an indoor. I think that's a 38. Yeah, it's a 38 caliber. 357 Magnum, and then this is a 357 Magnum interior. Has a really nice tail, and generally guns, you'll have a dry fire, you'll have a body, maybe a snap layer on top. The body is really where a lot of the power comes from, and then you have a tail, and the tail sometimes you even will do like this to the tail, so it's really clearing space out for the other layers. Let's hear them all together. And then with the howitzer, if you want to go like this is the final gunshot, and the story's ending. And it's the final gunshot and the story's ending, and it echoes out. Now, you could go for days with that thunder if you wanted. So it's similar to the punch. You've got the pre-sound, which is the dry fire. You've got like a poppy, snappy layer. You've got your body. And you've got a tail, which you really don't need any of the transient for. I can do the same trick on this one using auto-align post. It gets a little tricky with the stereo layer, but maybe if we're shaving the transient of the stereo layer, we don't need this so much. So I like to do a similar thing, like what's the predominant sound? It's this body one. So we go to M, SFX 5, we hit render, and you can see it's even changed the waveform on this one. Let's hear how it sounds. Let's take the howitzer out. Let's take the howitzer and the thunder out, and we'll undo. So that's with it aligned. Oops. I got to go back 2 steps. Okay. And here's with it not aligned. So it's not that much of a difference. Unaligned. Here's aligned. I would say it's a little better with it aligned, not too much. Yeah, and Simon says Krotos Weaponizer is really good for designing guns. I use that all the time. It's kind of a specialized tool, so maybe, yeah, and you can't align stuff as easily in Weaponizer because it's basically a sample playback. So it is good, but it's not, it doesn't let you do this. So you have to be very careful. So this, to me, is a pretty good gunshot now. See, if I just went with one layer, I'll mute the other ones. That compared to this, night and day difference. So layering is good. You need to layer stuff. You don't need to layer stuff 10 tracks deep though. So just use the number of layers that are needed to make the sound punch and make it cut through. If you're using design sounds that are just dropping in from a library, you might only need one sound. But if you're really creating them from individual layers, you know, you'll need just enough to get the job done and then stop. Don't keep adding, because then it's like, it just turns into mush. So yeah, use as few layers as possible, but don't be afraid to separate the layers into frequency components, and use the strength of each layer to make the individual sound be exactly what it needs to be. Let me go through the comments real quick, see if there's anything. Okay, Chow says, I remember the cloth wish comes in stereo. However, when you put it there, it's in mono. Okay, let's talk about mono versus stereo sound effects then. So I like using more mono sound effects, especially for something that needs to be tied to motion on the screen. Mono sounds are easier to localize. They're easier to pan in 5.1. And to be fair, most sounds in our world are mono. They just are. there's not really stereo sounds. The stereo is the spatialization of the sound. So I prefer relying on mono sounds. For bigger sounds like a gunshot, excuse me, I will add, gosh, where am I going here? I will add a bigger stereo layer like this gunshot here, or an explosion. You know, I'll add lots of stereo layers. But for things that are just tied to realistic on-screen sounds, mono is really good. So good comment. For vocalizations like a grunt, I always try to pull from production sound, but I'll show you. Sometimes you got to cut them in. So let's add a vox. And I want you guys to be able to hear this. Efforts you can generally grab from library or even record them yourself. Soundly has some pretty decent ones. The problem with these is they don't sound big enough. They're like somebody in a quiet room with a microphone, knowing they're in front of a microphone, so they're like they're not painful enough. That one's marginally better. So let's check this out. You want these efforts to be a result of the impact. So it comes after the punch, not during the punch, after the punch. Okay, so that sells it versus this. Yeah, then it's like, oh, he's acting. But if you put it after the punch, he's responding to the punch. That works. You can even slide it maybe a frame or two later. Nah, back where it was is good. So don't be afraid to break sounds into, you know, preceding the actual sound and then the effect of the sound. The same thing for a gunshot. You know, there's a gunshot. Well, what is the bullet hit? Does it hit wood? Does it hit a person? Does it just go off into the, you know, ether? So you got to think about the impact, and really that comes down to telling the story. If this gun is shooting at somebody, the actual gunshot might be very quiet compared to what it would really be, but the ricochet or the bullet by is going to be super loud. So let's add a bullet by. I'm just going to grab one. I'm not going to spend too much time making it. Oh, let's go with that one. Let's go with that one. This could be stereo, but I'm just going to do mono. So if we're from the character's perspective, somebody's shooting at them, you're not going to have a dry fire, and the body is probably going to be lower. Guns sound different the further away they are. Like, it won't sound like this lower. It'll actually be a different type of sound. But just for efficiency, I'm just going to lower it. And if we're really going for realistic, if they're far enough away, you hear the bullet go by first, then the gunshot. And that is like kind of cool because it's like, whoa, you know, there's no tell. You just get the zip of the by. Let's pan this. You get the zip of the by, and then the gunshot is afterwards. Kind of cool. Other questions we have, let's see. Mr. Nelson says, what would the benefit be doing sound design using a sampler? So samplers, again, like Simon said, weaponizer is a good one to use too. You can also use contact. It's nice to have things at your fingertips and play them with an instrument. So that is a nice thing to do. Chow says, but why does the library have them in stereo? It's easier to go from stereo to mono than the other way around. Simon says, so mono sound with stereo reverb. Stereo tail. this is a tail sound on the gun. This is not a reverb I'm adding. Basically, the sounds that need to tell you the environment will be stereo or size. Stereo is a great way to sell size as well, because the differences between the left and right channel can give you an idea of the size of either the space or the sound. But for sounds that need to be tied to the screen, mono is the way to go. Okay. Do you use perpetual license of Pro Tools? Nope, I pay every month. Any tips for creating variety in punches, especially when in a heavy action movie like John Wick, or do you end up copy pasting a lot of the same punch sounds? So what I like to do for that is you can do it to picture and know that like, hey, each one of these is going to be different, and you can painstakingly go through. Or one thing I like to do is go to like the end of my session and just create a bunch of packs, a punch pack basically. So I'll end up with something like, you know, head punch 1. And then this will be like block 1, block 2. And then what I can do is look, you know, if I basically create the sounds just listening to it, not looking at a picture. Then if there's a block that needs to happen, I can grab from here and drop it in my timeline. So that making like basically sound packs, irrespective of picture, is a great option to do. And variety in the punches, like choose different material, pitch shift things, like especially the lower frequency stuff. You know, grab your favorite pitch shifter and pitch stuff up and down, and then have pitch variety in all that stuff. So all that's good. Are there any websites with films or short film scenes we can use for sound design? I have one. This film that I've used in most of my recent videos, I actually made this short film for practicing sound design and sound editing on. So you can pick this up on my website. It's forlow-digital.com, and it's called Family Heirloom. $50. $50. Yeah, so, okay, covered that. Let me go back to my notes. Organization of sounds, high to low, we did that. Oh, this is a good one. Okay. Excuse me again. So, and thank you for your patience with me as I am sick. I can actually take this off. Monophonic. I like to approach a scene monophonically when I'm doing sound design. The human ear can only focus on like maybe 2 sounds at a time. So for sound effects heavy sequences, look at every shot as like its own scene. Basically, it stands alone, you know? So instead of layering stuff super deep and having, you know, like 10 layers and stuff going on in the background, try to lead the person's ear from one shot to the next with sound effects. So that's not to say, you know, not to layer sounds, but like look at each moment as its own sound instead of stacking, because you can't track a stack, you know, like if this is going here and this is going here, it's like Baroque counterpoint, and, you know, it's just too much, especially when you add the visuals to it. So people will call it Mickey Mousing, where you're doing what you see, but it's a really effective way to lead people from point A to point B instead of A and B being on top of each other. So when you're doing sound design or sound effects editing, try to look at things that way. Like, I can focus on one thing at a time. I can't multitask with my ears. So what's the thing I'm focused on? And just try to nail that, you know, and the other stuff is going to kind of either be muted or fall to the background, and it's not going to matter so much. Really look at it like you're playing a lead guitar line or a monophonic synthesizer. You can't play chords. So one sound at a time. Okay, so that's good. Talked about that. Micro alignment, frame accuracy. Really important for stuff to sync up. If this punch was a frame earlier, a frame late, or 2 frames, it might not seem like a lot, but when you add up all those errors, they compound and they make it to where it doesn't feel real. So having things accurately lined up, synced to picture, is super important. We haven't talked too much about mixing and EQing stuff, so let's talk about that. If you have a good sound edit, you're not going to have to be EQing too much, but there's always a chance that the sound effect set is not going to be great. So you're going to be using preview automation a lot, and balancing, you know, stuff and figuring out how to make stuff fit. You can also use clip effects. Those are somewhat recent, like past 5 years or so. And the nice thing about that is it's going to follow the clip around. So if you copy and paste stuff and you're using clip effects, maybe bring up some lows. I use this a lot when I'm sound effects editing, especially cars. I might want to bring up some of the bass in the engine. So using clip effects, if this sound gets reused, that'll follow it around. If you're doing automation, just make sure you do preview mode, kind of listen to it, and, you know, figure out where you're boosting or cutting. Oh, and we need to have loop playback on. Yeah, it is on. But it's, oh, because it's too short of a selection. Using the lows from something so that the highs from the next sound up if I don't want the lows from this one, sure, I'll bring up the highs. So use the strength of each sound and then don't forget to write your automation. So let's hear the difference here. I'm actually going to listen with you guys. I took my headphones off. So let's undo that EQ work. We'll make sure we actually undo it. This is with no EQ. And then here is with yes EQ. It sounds better EQ'd. So all I've done with the EQ is look at each sound and decide, okay, this slap, I'm just using the highs from it. This mid, I'm really bringing up the highs, the high mids, and I'm cutting the lows. And then on the low, I'm doing the opposite. I'm highlighting on the fundamental, which is down at 51 hertz, and bringing it up. So that's with EQ, here's without. Huge difference. With EQ, without. So mixing can make a big difference, and you just have to know what each sound is doing, what its strength is, and how to use it effectively. Okay. Lost Guitar says, do it the Gary Rydstrom way, less is more. Yeah. I've mixed movies where there's like 10 layers of sound for a punch, and it just doesn't sound good. Once you start muting stuff, it's like, okay, now it sounds good. Organization like the sketchpad with packs at the end of the session. How else can we work inside our template without making a mess of it? Well, okay, so I don't like sound editing in a template. I like sound editing in just a blank session because every show is different. Some of them are going to have more A tracks, more B tracks. So I like to really quarantine off my sound editing from sound mixing and just do the sound editing in like the most basic template and add tracks as needed. So one thing you can do is you can make work tracks. You could make, I mean, if you're sound editing a big action movie, you're going to have like just punch sound effects. You know, you might have like 8 mono, I usually call them like hand to hand, H2H, hand to hand. You might have like 16 weapons. You might have, I mean, every show is different, but vehicles, probably more than 12. So organizing your session like this will help you visually see where tracks are at, but also just keep things super organized. And then, yeah, keeping the edit separate from the mix. That's something I harp on constantly. Kanaka Brad says, it's always good to go back and catalog all the good stuff you create. Yes, that is something I don't do enough of. Greg says, say you have distance, explosion, or gunshot. Do sync effects to visual. Okay. Generally, I will sync it to the visual. Every once in a while, you get a project where they want the realism of the visual and then the sound following. And, you know, that is super cool when you get to do that. Kevin is asking for a sword fight. That's going to take a while. And I've only got 10 minutes left. So for a sword fight, the big thing is to keep the pitches of the swords different enough to track who's hitting, who has the power in the fight. So having two different pitches for the shings and the clashes will tell the story with sound. Yeah, it's fascinating how effects mixing generally doesn't require that many plugins. It doesn't. It's basically EQ, volume, maybe a compressor every once in a while, but generally a lot less than dialogue mixing. Okay, speaking of that, we talked about limiting. We talked about EQing for separation. Panning is important. Although generally a lot of stuff will go in your center channel if you're in 5.1. Balancing. Okay, so here's a huge one. And this will probably take us to kind of the end. So with a action-oriented movie or thriller, or really most movies, they really rely on music. They just hang their hat on music. And the composer wants their music to be loud. The director wants the music to be loud. If the dialogue is loud and the music is loud, where does that leave your sound effects? Generally, there's not a lot of room. So what you have to do is carve out space in the music, EQ the music, cut the mids out or lower the level of the music enough to where the sound effects can be riding on top. You really want the sound effects to cut through the music. And one thing that'll really help you with that is listening to the music while you're sound editing. When you're adding sound effects, you do have to check stuff in a vacuum and just solo the sound effects, but listen to either the temp music or if you have work in progress from the composer, try to get that and listen to it, because in the mix, the sound effects will need to work with that. So when you're editing, if the sound effects already work with that, you'll be miles ahead when the mix starts. So pitch of the sound effects, the transient versus body or sustain of the sound effects, like all that stuff is crucial to making the sound effects fit in the mix. So the other thing is where impacts happen. If the music has a lot of drums or it has a lot of stings and hits and stuff like that, you will need to decide if you're mixing, is the music the star or are the sound effects the star? So leaving space for the music to be the star is good. But there's also times where like there needs to be an impact, the music doesn't hit it, so there the sound effects can speak out above. Also keep in mind your overall level of stuff. It's so easy to just push all the faders up when things get exciting and make it super loud. But if everything is loud, nothing is loud. So if the music is bombastic and it's like, chugging along and it's really exciting, it's going to be exciting even if the music is a little bit lower in volume. And by doing that, you will let the sound effects have room to sit on top of the music. And that's the way I prefer to mix stuff, is have the sound effects up and have them poke through and have the music kind of, if it's there, we talked about the Bourne series and other stuff where there's, and even that Harry Potter film, there's no music in those scenes. So the sound effects can just be, they can just be on their own. If you can talk the director into that, that is really nice. Okay, so we talked about that, balancing, layering. We talked about that. Oh, somebody, I forget who mentioned this. A really nice trick to do Like this gunshot would be a good one to do it with. You can do this. Let's say you have 3 VCAs. We'll call one music. Well, we'll rename them. So this will be music. This will be BGs. Let's do a Foley one too. These aren't going to do anything. They're just going to be here to show you this trick. So if I have a big impact here, how can I sell this impact? Well, a really nice trick to do, you could do this subtly or not so subtly, is to dip stuff before. So just start writing the music down. You can do a quick one like this, where you dip the backgrounds out, maybe just like 4 frames before the impact. And do it with everything. So you just get a little silent break. This tiny little ear cleaner will make this impact so much bigger if you do this. Generally music you can even duck out like completely like that. That can be very effective. You don't need much, a couple frames, 2 to 4 frames. You can, like horror films for jump scares will often do it way more like this, like it's coming. You got the pillow over your ears because you're ready for the jump scare. But feel free to just do it like, a couple frames before the impact. Okay, so that's that. Any other questions? Are you happy with your JBL Mark IIs? They're great. They were cheap. Do you ever try multi-band ducking? I don't usually use multi-band ducking. I try to do stuff manually by using EQ and automating the EQ. I just have more control over it. And it only does it when I want it to. So I try to do stuff manually. All right, I think that's it. I covered... I think I got through pretty much everything. There's so much to sound design and sound editing. So this is really just, focused on a couple of ways to get your sound effects to really cut through. Again, the 3 factors are the right sounds at the right moment at the right level. And level can be volume, it could be EQ. Frequency is really just adjusting the volumes of different parts of the signal. But the right sounds at the right moment at the right volume or right level, like if you get those 3 things right, your sound effects are going to cut through. They're going to sound really nice. And it really boils down to knowing your library and knowing the context of the scene and how the sounds need to interact with the story. The sound effects can tell a story. They can support the story. They can give you clues about things that aren't told in the script. There's a lot that sound effects can do that is showing instead of telling. If the dialogue is the telling, the sound effects can really be the showing. Music is too, but music is kind of like holding a person's hand and being like, hey, I want you to feel sad here, or I want you to be excited. And the sound effects are much more rooted in like the reality of the scene and selling that reality, which is, as storytellers, that's kind of our job. So thank you guys for being patient with me while I've been sick, and all your comments and stuff like that. So yeah, it's been really nice being with you guys, and I'll see you on the next stream. I'll try my best to get an edited video out this week, but I'm sick and I've got a bunch of work to do, so that may or may not happen. The other thing I'm working on is I think I'm going to set up a class, and it's going to take me a while, but if you guys have any like requests or anything like, I would really like a class on this, please let me know. You can email me or just comment on a video. And I'm going to set it up to where you can take the class, you can get a certificate, and, hopefully it'll be a addition to like the YouTube videos that's a little more academic and focused on education. So that's something I'll be working on. And then the usual YouTube stuff will follow. So thank you guys. I'll see you next time. Until then, take care, and yeah, enjoy the work, enjoy the time off, and keep the ideas for videos coming, because I try to base everything on what you guys want. So I'll see you next time. Bye.